to our seminars. It seems our seminars keep getting better and better. And today we have with us Professor Michel Chossudovsky, who is the director of the Center for Research on Globalization in Montreal, Canada, and Professor Emeritus at the University of Ottawa. I mean, there's actually, the biography is some 2 pages, and there's a huge list of books as well. But I just want to highlight a few things, and that is it's his book, The Globalization of Poverty and the New World Order of 2003, was for several weeks a bestseller in various parts of the world, and it was a pioneering book in actually demystifying the structure and the mechanisms of the structural adjustment programs that have actually led to much dislocation in and around the third world, and specifically, and the effects of which now, in austerity and otherwise, and similar measures, are actually reaching Europe at the present time. So Professor Chossudovsky's pioneering work is on China, on analyzing the conditions of capitalist restoration in China, was also another pioneering work, in which the book was in the early 80s, I think. He later set up the Center for Research for Globalization, which has become one of the leading centers globally for alternative media, and it's one of the most sought after websites. It's got a huge number of visitations on the internet, such that it ranks among the websites of the media, the top media websites globally. And so we are actually very honored and privileged to have with us today Professor Chossudovsky. The topic of his lecture would be, he would be addressing the global economic crisis, its impact, its global impact, and its specific impact on the Middle East. He would probably choose a couple of countries, probably significant countries, which have undergone an Arab Spring type transition, Egypt and Tunisia, to analyze closely and to illustrate what has been the impact of neoliberal policies and structural adjustment-like policies on societies in the Arab world and so on. So we are very happy. I mean, I could talk. As I said, I have 2 pages to read, but I will not do that. But we're very happy to have with us Professor Chossudovsky, and I leave the floor to him. He will speak for sort of as long as he sees fit for the time being, and we'll have sort of around 45 minutes, let's say. And after that, we will have time for questions and answers and so forth. Thank you all for coming.
Well, I'm absolutely delighted to be at the National University of Singapore and the Middle East Institute. I understand these are the new premises of the Institute. I'm very gratified by the invitation and the hospitality at the university and in this wonderful city. And over the years, I've had many students from Singapore, so I think we share the realities of this part of the world. I travel quite frequently to Southeast Asia. I'm perhaps more focused on Asian realities than those of the Middle East, but given the underlying political situation in the last, at least I would say in the last few years, or maybe in the last 10 years, I've been putting a lot of emphasis on understanding particularly the geopolitics of the Middle East and the various conflicts which characterize the region. Today I would like to address the economic dimensions. First of all, by focusing on the global economic crisis, particularly the so-called 2008 global economic crisis, but also put it in the broader perspective of IMF interventions. If we view the global economic crisis, we have to understand it has a certain history. And I should stress that this crisis is the most serious crisis in world history. This is not an understatement. By far, the economic and social dislocations far surpass those of the Great Depression of the 1930s. And they affect a much larger number of countries. Often when one is living a crisis, one is not able to analyze from within. I was also struck when reviewing the Great Depression in the 1930s that the analysts writing in 1931-32 would actually say that this was an era of growth and development and so on. If you look at the reports coming out from the Harvard Economic Institute at the time, there was no understanding until a few years later that the Great Crash had actually resulted in a Great Depression. And similarly, today, there's a tendency to camouflage the underlying realities. And I think it's also important to say that this crisis didn't start in 2000, it didn't start in 2008. It started most probably in the early 1980s. And what characterizes that period is, first of all, we have a shift from Keynesian macroeconomic reform to neoliberalism, starting in the early 80s with what it was called the Reagan-Thatcher era, major restructuring in Western countries, and then in the developing world, what occurred in the early 80s was the debt crisis, the crisis of the external debt, and a new era of macroeconomic reform was initiated largely under the supervision of the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. This debt crisis was triggered by the collapse in commodity prices for major exports from the developing world. I should say that that crash in commodity export prices was in effect triggered by commodity cartels. I'll give you an example of the price of coffee in 1985 approximately. The price of coffee was of the order of $2.5 a kilo. Okay, that's the FOB. That's what's quoted in the commodity exchanges. And by the late 1980s, early 90s, it had collapsed to less than $1. So there was a major collapse in commodity prices, and together with that, all these countries were pushed into a balance of payments situation which was unsustainable, and heightened external debt, the creditors initiated what was called policy-based lending under the auspices of the IMF and the World Bank. Now, I should mention that the IMF and the World Bank are bureaucracies. They don't ultimately determine necessarily policy directions. Well, they play a very significant role, but they are acting on behalf of creditors. And to understand the logic of this crisis, we have to, and how it affects countries and their sovereignty, we have to address the mechanics behind policy-based lending, what was also called was also called conditionalities. Conditionalities, in other words, lending, coming to the rescue of indebted countries by establishing conditionalities. Let me explain briefly. I brought with me $100 million note, okay? Now, we won't discuss the names of the countries, but let's say developing country X has something of the order of 1 billion, simplify the data. You have $1 billion of debt, which approximately, let's say $2 billion of debt, right? Which approximately means that the debt servicing on that $2 billion is something of the order of $200 million, okay? Payment of principal plus interest, okay? Due to the collapse in commodity prices, these countries are not able to service their debt, and they are immediately put on blacklists by creditors and so on and so forth. Potentially their whole export economy is threatened. And so they are then directed to the International Monetary Fund, who sends in a mission and says, we are here to help you. Okay? So that is the scenario. So the International Monetary Fund says, well, you have a $200 million debt to the Paris Club, which is the club of official creditors. Then you have debts to the London Club, to private creditors, and so on and so forth. And they say, well, we will negotiate a policy-based loan. And a policy-based loan is the following. The Minister of Finance takes the $100 million, it takes the $100 million, but before the country accepts this $100 million, they have to abide by a certain number of conditionalities, okay? And those conditionalities are budget cuts, evidently, austerity measures, drastic austerity measures, but also they have to, they curtail their health and education, they may have to close down hospitals and schools, and they have to deregulate trade, and so on. And so, take the money. Now, but there's another condition they have to fulfill, is that they have to repay the money they owe to the external creditors, which is of the order, as I mentioned at the beginning, $200 million. So Ali, give me back the 100 billion. Now what happens is, and this is why very, very important, this is fictitious money, okay? When the IMF hands $100 million to a country which owes $200 million to foreign creditors, the money goes back to the creditors, and the country still owes $100 million. So give me another $100 million. You understand the logic? The quick disbursing loan of the International Monetary Fund, its main function is to trigger repayment of foreign debt. It is fictitious, so that when you read these reports and you see the IMF has given $1 billion to Egypt, or 3.9 or whatever, which is guaranteed by the UAE, etc., that is fictitious money, because the debt service, otherwise the country can't repay its debt, and the only way it repays its debt is by borrowing new money and then reimbursing. It is based on a very old principle of usury, which exists in Asian societies and other parts of the world, that when a landless farmer is indebted to his landlord or to the merchant, and he says, Master, I'm so sorry, I don't have money to pay you. And then the master will say, well, no problem, my son. I will lend you the money, and with the money I lend you, you pay me back, okay? That is the basis of these structural adjustment loans. And there is no inflow of money into the country. As a result, people talk about investment. This is not an investment loan, okay? Investment goes into capital formation, and it is the mechanism whereby the sovereignty of many countries, I would say more than 100 countries, is affected and taken over, essentially policies taken over by international financial institutions acting on behalf of either Western governments or private banking institutions. And in that regard, they impose what is called the Washington Consensus, which is the consensus of the US Treasury, the IMF, the World Bank, and various Washington think tanks. And we have seen the evolution of these policies from the early 80s up to the present, whereby different categories of countries have been subjected to these reforms. In the early 80s, it was largely Latin America and Sub-Saharan Africa. In the early 90s, it was or the late 80s, early 90s, it was the Eastern Europe, the former Soviet Union, which was subjected to these reforms. In the Middle East, the reforms started pretty much I would say, in the mid-80s. And the consequences were pretty dramatic. In Egypt, there were several policy reforms which took place in the 1980s, but the watershed period in Egypt was the early 80s, when a major agreement was reached with the International Monetary Fund in 1991 at the height of the Gulf War, and it was conditional upon, it was accompanied by the cancelling of a major military debt which the Egyptian government had established with the United States, and it was again strong economic medicine. Now, I happen to have been accidentally in the Minister of Finance's office on the day that program was sent to Parliament. And I can say that everybody in Egypt, within the government, I met people at the Central Bank, Ministry of Finance, I was received by the Minister of Finance, who actually didn't exercise any authority whatsoever on these policies. It was decided at the level of the presidency. It was imposed, and everybody was against it. And the senior advisors from Mubarak's office were there, and we were debating on alternatives, and then the Minister of Finance was sitting at the table and said, please excuse me, but I have to go to the Parliament to present the IMF program. And there we were sitting, and so that, in effect, that's of course at the level of anecdote, but I can tell you from my experience that these reforms have a fundamental impact on the sovereignty of countries. And that is, of course, crucial also in assessing the protest movement in various countries in recent years. I can say as well that as far as Egypt is concerned, the protest movement was far more directed against the impacts of these reforms which were imposed on the country than on they didn't actually target the protest movement against the IMF and the World Bank, okay? They targeted the protest movement against Mubarak, against Ben Ali in Tunisia. But when you look at the logic and you look at the underlying process of impoverishment which occurred in the course of a period of over 20 years, let's say from 91 to 2011, what you're dealing with is the implementation of these devastating reforms. Now, let me get back to that a little bit later in the presentation, because in the course of the 1990s, we had, first of all, we had an extension of these reform packages not only to Latin America and Sub-Saharan Africa, but to the Middle East, and also starting in the 90s, these reforms were applied in the countries of the former Soviet bloc and in Eastern Europe. And then we have another, I think, if we look at the 1990s, we have another landmark date, which certainly people in Singapore are well aware of, is the 1997 Asian crisis. Now, the 1997 Asian crisis can be explained in several ways. Alan Greenspan, I remember his historical speech that he made when stock markets started to collapse in the fall of '97. He made the statement to the effect that the Asian flu had spread to America. Okay, now immediately people in economics departments, financial analysts, started to author articles on the Asian flu, okay, which was a ridiculous concept from an economic standpoint, to say that ultimately the crisis in Asia was spreading to other countries. And what did not come out in the review and analysis of the Asian crisis was the fact that this crisis had been instigated and by what we might describe as institutional speculators, largely in the currency markets. And this was not heralded by the economic profession in any way. The financial analysts preferred not to talk about it because it's a no-no. But essentially, if we're not talking about Singapore, but we're essentially talking about the countries which were most affected: Thailand, Indonesia, Korea, and perhaps also the Philippines to a lesser extent. And this was characterized by this was instigated by what is described as short selling of these major Asian currencies, with a view to triggering the collapse of those currencies. I can explain it very briefly because it's an important concept. If you have a regulated currency market, I know that, of course, Malaysia had its own plan to counter these speculative attacks. And since I've been to Malaysia on quite a number of occasions, I've met of course, I know the former Prime Minister Mahathir Mohamad, and also the people who were behind these policies. But essentially, if you take the case of Thailand, and you take the Thai baht, now these speculative attacks are undertaken through naked short selling. And what you do is the following: you start selling Thai baht. I'm talking about institutional speculators will sell Thai bahts by the trillions. You don't own these Thai bahts, okay? That's the whole basis of naked short selling. You don't own them, so you can sell them, but that's all right. You sell them, at the same time, the act of selling them on a very large scale triggers the collapse of that currency. And then at the time when the short selling contract comes to terms, of course, then you buy back the baht in the spot market, and in the meantime, you made a 50% profit because the Thai baht is only worth half of its previous value. So that these operations were waged. They were waged by major financial institutions, countries that managed to obviate these attacks were countries which had some form of protection of their currency, where these types of short-selling operations were not allowed to proceed. It's worth noting that in Korea, the lifting of currency controls was imposed on the currency on Korea, South Korea, shortly before the 1997 elections. Kim Dae-jun won in the first round of elections. He took a position against these reforms and analyzed their implications, and then he was instructed by a representative of the US Treasury that all the candidates in the election race had to abide by the IMF reforms. They were imposed by Wall Street, they were imposed by Korea's external creditors, and shortly before the collapse, Washington demanded a regime change at the Ministry of Finance and at the central bank, where key personnel were replaced, but particularly the finance minister and the governor of the Central Bank of the Republic of Korea. And what happened then, of course, was the collapse of the Korean War and the imposition of a very detailed policy-based loan agreement, which was leaked to the internet actually in early 1998. I discovered it on a Korean newspaper site and then forwarded to a number of other analysts, but we got that report, and it had, contrary to the types of agreements which were signed in the 1980s and early 90s with developing countries, this agreement was very, very specific, because it also demanded the breakup of some of the major Korean conglomerates, the chaebols, and they call that the spin-off or the spin-up, and as a result, many Korean financial institutions and industrial outfits were taken over by Western capital. I won't get into details on that, but it's very important to understand the evolution and the logic of these IMF World Bank reforms, which went from imposing conditionalities on developing countries to subsequently framing policy reforms for developed countries of Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union, and ultimately Korea, which was one of the most advanced industrial economies worldwide. And the next stage of this evolution, of course, is in the wake of the 2008 economic crisis, when the IMF economic medicine is then applied to a number of European countries, including Iceland, Portugal, Spain, and Greece. In effect, I should mention that the thrust of these reforms goes against the fundamentals of the IMF mandate as defined by the Bretton Woods institutions, which was essentially to maintain stability in the foreign exchange markets. That's very well formulated, and in effect, while the IMF never recommends countries to devalue their currency, there's no case where they actually put that as a condition. It is invariably de facto that the currencies of countries will collapse as a result of IMF intervention. There have been cases of collapses of the order of 70–80% in the value of currencies. I mean, if you take the case of some of the Latin American countries. But in many cases, the collapse can be of the order of 20, 30, 40, 50%. And this immediately will have consequences with regard to real wages, obviously, and so on. I should mention that the Bretton Woods Agreement was also predicated on the notion of fostering stability in prices. But as everybody understands, a devaluation triggers inflation. It triggers inflation because international commodity values are dollarized. So that immediately when you devalue, let's say you devalue a currency by 50%, the price of basic food staples, which are determined at the level of the international market, will double. And that has been the underlying predicament of many countries subjected to these reforms. Now, let me perhaps focus on a couple of more concrete examples of intervention, in particularly focusing on the Middle East. I should mention that there's a certain logic behind these reforms, and it's important to look at the detail and the functioning of markets when subjected to particular policy interventions. The protest movement in Egypt did not emerge overnight in 2011. Already in the wake of the reform package in 1991, a number of changes occurred, particularly in agriculture, but also in industry and in the services economy. But I'll focus for a moment on agriculture. First of all, there were changes in the structure of land tenure. Land was reprivatized, repealing some of the reforms which had been adopted in the 1950s under Nasser, where peasants received land as part of an agrarian reform program. But also significantly, with deregulation, the price of farm inputs went fly high. And I'm talking about the price of fertilizer and insecticide. In Egypt, those prices virtually doubled overnight. And together with that, farmers were not able to acquire credit. Okay? Now imagine a situation, and what I'm describing for Egypt has occurred in numerous countries. Imagine a situation of a breadbasket economy which has more than 3,000 years of history, which is one of the most prosperous agricultural regions in the world. Of course, facing various difficulties. It's not to say that there wasn't food dependency prior to 1991. There were already imports of food and so on. But what happened in 1991 is the following. Local producers were precipitated into bankruptcy due to rising input prices on the one hand, and rising costs of fuel and in access to credit, in other words, high interest rates. But you have, in essence, a situation where the producers, the local producers, are facing a level of costs, and they now have to compete in international markets with the import of food staples. And those imports have been characteristic of the actions of the Western countries for many, many years. The United States and the European Union, they dump their commodity surpluses on developing countries, including breadbasket economies. But for them to be able to do that, simultaneously they destabilize the conditions of production and trade within the country, which is the object of this deregulation of the grain market and the process of imports of grain surpluses from the United States and the European Union. Some of it is instrumented through food aid and so on. There are various arrangements. But bear in mind is that if you take the case of Egypt, you can take the case of any other country. You take the case of Rwanda, which was even more dramatic. But you take the case of Egypt, where the Nile Valley is the breadbasket, and you bring in commodity staples from the United States, which are heavily subsidized, as we know, with very low interest rates, very low fuel costs of fuel, and then you bring them into a market where the price of fertilizer and insecticide and the domestic price of fuel has been pushed up. So whether they are efficient or not is not the issue. They are not in the same environment. Okay? So this is a manipulation of free trade. It's nothing particularly new in world history. It goes back to the British Empire in India, where, you know, what happened in India, you had free trade coming from Britain, including cotton fabrics. Okay? Cotton fabrics manufactured in Britain that then exported back to the countries where the cotton came from. Okay? At the time, from Bengal on the one hand, and from Egypt. So what happens? In India, the British Empire imposed what they called internal transit duties. And those internal transit duties means that if you sell in the internal market, you have to pay taxes. It's an internal tariff. And at the same time, they removed the external tariff. That was the whole basis of British free trade. It was, they imposed tariffs internally, and so that the Indian producers, and particularly in the textile industry, the Indian producers were even more efficient than what was produced in Manchester most probably up until the 1820s. But what happened is that you bankrupt the local market by imposing very high costs of transportation within the internal market. Okay? Those were the internal transit duties imposed by the British in India. How do they do it in countries like Egypt or in developing countries? The World Bank imposes, as part of the agreements it reaches with the countries, it imposes a tax on fuel, a very high tax on fuel, okay? Much higher than what exists in the United States of America. So that they say you have to collect revenue to pay back, of course, the creditors, but we're going to impose that revenue collection on fuel. Now, if you impose revenue collection on fuel, the immediate impact is that local producers are driven into bankruptcy. Okay? Now, I saw that in Rwanda. I made several trips to Rwanda, and also twice on behalf of the United Nations. And then when I went back in the late 90s, after the imposition of the structural adjustment program on a country which was self-sufficient, not only self-sufficient in food, but it was exporting food to neighboring countries, what I witnessed was the influx of commodity surpluses from the European Union, primarily, and as well as the United States, and the whole structure of commodity trade had been disrupted because the price of taking these commodities 40 kilometers, it's a small country, is prohibitive, and therefore you can't compete with the imports. In West Africa, they import potatoes and eggs from the European Union because local producers are not able to transport their goods to market in the capital city, and these are very short distances because of the price of fuel. Now, going back to Egypt, we had a situation where, as a result of the increase in the price of farm inputs, the actual levels of production and productivity collapsed by about 50%. Well, I'm sorry, I don't have the exact figures on that, but it was a very dramatic collapse in the levels of agricultural production. And that was implemented in 92, 93. I'll give you another example, 1994, another breadbasket in another region of the world, the Ukraine. Now, what happened in the Ukraine was an agreement reached with IMF in Madrid in 1994, which led to a 900% increase in the price of fuel. Okay? 900% increase in the price of fuel. What does that do? It literally destroys the real economy. And they agreed on that, and as a result of that, but they agreed on that while also lifting the trade barriers to the influx of food imports on the grounds that Ukraine had to compete with, to remain sort of market efficient and so on. They had to compete with imports, but they had to compete with imports under a policy framework which had virtually destabilized their national economy. Now, if we look at again the Middle East, we had, starting in the 1980s, we had reforms which were implemented in many countries. Tunisia is notorious in that respect, since there were the bread riots. The bread riots started in 1984. There was a major protest movement. This was already it was still under the presidency of Habib Bourguiba, who played the historical role in liberating his country from French occupation. Those early reforms took place. The bread riots occurred. They were repealed under the government of Bourguiba. Bourguiba actually went against these reforms, which had been imposed by the International Monetary Fund. So there was a retraction, and the hike in bread prices was reversed. But subsequently, 3 years later, Bourguiba and his government were removed with a so-called bloodless coup d'etat. And then, of course, we saw the statement of General General Ben Ali, who became president in 1997, and who was recently, starting in 2011, was the object of the protest movement. But bear in mind, people in Tunisia they were protesting Ben Ali, but they were largely protesting the reforms which were imposed by the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank starting in 1987. And the same thing is true in Egypt. The protest movement did not target the people behind these governments. In other words, they did not target the puppet masters, they targeted the puppets. And we see now in Egypt how there's continuity. The continuity is the continuity of the neoliberal economic reforms. It's also worth noting, and that's very significant, that one of the major factors behind these, the protest movement in Egypt was the privatization of water. There there was the price of water, particularly both in urban and rural areas, had gone fly high, and one of the major features also of these reforms with regard to agriculture is to privatize water. Okay, it's a World Bank program. It's not an IMF program. It's a World Bank program. And the argument is to say we have to privatize water because water is a commodity. It's you know, and when you do that in the Nile Valley, you destroy agriculture, literally destroy agriculture. There's another country which was subjected to similar reforms at an earlier period. It was Somalia. Somalia was also a well-functioning food economy, livestock economy, and then the World Bank came in and started, well, they privatized water in a semi-arid country, but they also privatized veterinarian services in a country whose main activity was livestock. And what happened was the collapse of of livestock exports to the Gulf countries and Saudi Arabia, which then led ultimately to a demise of the national economy. At the time, in the late, we're talking about the late 1980s. I'm sorry, it's not the late 1980s. It was at an earlier period, but at one point, salaries in the public sector declined to something of the order of $5 a month. These are official figures. You might say that this sounds absurd, that salaries in a country can collapse. Well, they collapsed through the fact that inflation was eating up the real value of these salaries. And the World Bank intervened with a program to restore the levels of wages in Somalia, but they set as a condition that this program had to be implemented within the same budgetary envelope, requiring the firing of something like 25% of the civil service, so that the recommendation of the World Bank is to say, we will finance the wage increases, the wage had gone down dramatically, by firing, you know, 1/4 of the civil service, and maybe hiking up the wage to, you know, to $7 or $10 a month. It was an absurd proposition. It was never implemented because the country then, the whole state structure collapsed, and the civil war unfolded, and at the basis of this crisis was the imposition of these deadly macroeconomic reforms. Well, I think I've covered quite a number of issues. The last phase, or the most recent phase in the application of these reforms, which were never really envisaged, and is their application to developed countries. It never entered my mind that these reforms, which were imposed on third world countries, could one day be imposed on countries like Portugal or Spain, or Greece, for that matter. But in effect, the solutions proposed by the International Monetary Fund, which imply major austerity measures, apart from all these issues of deregulation or re-regulation, have become the consensus in macroeconomic management. And they have been applied virtually in a universal fashion, both in the developing countries, in the countries of the former Soviet bloc, in Eastern Europe, and now in Western Europe. And this macroeconomic medicine is considered to be the solution to the crisis. Okay? If you look at what's going on in Germany and France, where austerity measures, they're not necessarily implemented with the support of the IMF, but they have ultimately the same flavor. They have different actors behind it. And as I mentioned, the IMF World Bank are bureaucracies. So that you have creditors, you have the European creditors, the American creditors, and they impose austerity measures on countries. And we are then told that these austerity measures constitute the solution to the crisis. I can tell you that there is no solution to the crisis when the solution to the crisis is the cause of the crisis. Because when you implement massive austerity measures, what do? You don't resolve the fiscal crisis of the state. There are less revenues coming in terms of taxes. You are triggering a chain of bankruptcies and so on, so that in effect, the types of reforms which are now being implemented and which have been implemented for more than 30 years in developing countries is creating conditions for the deepening of the crisis initiated, let's say, theoretically initiated in 2008. So there's no solution to this crisis when the solution to the crisis, in fact, triggers a deepening of this crisis, because it depresses people's wages, it creates more unemployment, and it is not a process of regenerating economic activity by tackling issues of unemployment, wages, and so on. And the program of quantitative easing, which is implemented in the United States, is essentially a financial mechanism. It has very little bearing on the real economy. So that I think it's very important to reflect on the mechanics of these reforms. And there's another dimension underlying the global economic crisis, which is the vast amounts of financial resources which are allocated to the military, the so-called defense. In Obama's first budget, let's say following the 2008-2009 economic crisis, defense expenditure was taking up something of all of $750 billion, dollars. When you bearing in mind that tax revenues, household tax revenues, are barely $1 trillion. The federal revenues were something of the order of $2.3 trillion, but a large share of government revenue was being channeled to the military, and which meant that the only way to maintain statutory public programs, health, education, and so on, is through an increase in the levels of debt. Today, this issue has been raised following the release of the national defense figures of something of the order of $650 billion. But I should mention that those figures, in fact, underestimate the true cost of the wars. Most of those wars are in the Middle East. Okay? So they're there to finance military expenditures. Some of the actual war budget is not included in the federal figures. So that the war, if you combine these expenditures with figures which are not included, the war may cost something of the order of $1 trillion. And This means that the United States and most Western countries involved in these military undertakings are facing a major fiscal crisis, which then backlashes on health, education, public services, and so on, reminiscent again of the types of policies which were adopted in the developing countries starting in the early 80s. Thank you very much. I think I look forward to having a discussion with you on this issue.